Number 5. The Jetway 707. The fascinating new Oldsmobile Toronado served as the foundation for Waldo Kottner and Robert Bevington's startup business, American Quality Coach. They started the new venture after Divco Wayne bought their previous business, Kottner Bevington, in 1964. Starting in 1965, the men put their focus on building the Oldsmobile 98 chassis. Soon after the Toronado debuted in 1966, Kottner and Bevington created a wide selection of specialized vehicles like ambulances, limousines, and hearses based on its front-wheel drive chassis. It didn't work out the way they had intended, though, when they tried to get funds for a prototype from their parent company, Miller Meteor. They were told they could not move forward with the intended project. The pristine status of the Miller Meteor Company was thought to be harmed by basing important cars on flashy Toronados. It was risky, especially since Divco Wayne had recently purchased Kottner Bevington as a more affordable alternative to their well-liked Cadillac coaches. Because at this point they were just stockholders, they didn't have much of a voice in the company. As a result, American Quality Coach was born. The first product from American Quality Coach was the Jetway 707, which was designed as an airport limousine. It had 8 doors, was 28 feet long, had a wheelbase of 185 inches, could seat 12 to 15 people, and was the first stretch limousine with dual rear axles. The Jetway 707 had a distinctive elevated roof in the form of a Vista Cruiser, built-in skylights, and a fully enclosed cargo room with a hinged back door. It was quite the sight. Unfortunately, all of their capital was invested in the equipment for their airport limos, and when the first line failed to sell, the company was forced to give up on the other coaches. A whole line of AQC hearses, ambulances, combination vehicles, and limousines were originally planned but abandoned. A current owner estimates that 52 Jetways were built between 1968 and 1970, but it's believed the number is as high as 150, according to professional car historian Bernie DeWinter. All coaches were built on 1968 Toronado chassis after this point, despite being advertised as 1970 vehicles. Just 2 years after it started, in 1970, AQC finally ran out of money and shut down after filing for bankruptcy. It's unclear exactly how many 707s are still in existence. According to widespread consensus, there aren't many. It was said that the 707 rusted quickly and was built with low-quality material. There is a brief summary of the Jetway 707 sales in 2015 online. One of them was listed for $20,000 on a Manitoba, Canada classified website, while another was sold for $3,000 on eBay. A blue and white 707 even sat in the weeds until it was sold for $7,000. What's your favorite antique car? Let us know in the comments and subscribe while you're down there. Number 4. Concrete ships. 9 sunken concrete ships can be seen in the Kiptopke State Park, which is close to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. The ships were built during World War II and scuttled to guard a now-closed ferry port. They've since evolved into tourist attractions and temporary habitats for many animal species. Concrete ships were first proposed in the 19th century, but it wasn't until the First World War that the United States government began to take a real interest in the idea. President Woodrow Wilson gave the go-ahead to build 24 ships throughout the war. There were only 12 delivered, and none of them were actually put to use. When the U.S. Maritime Commission was tasked to provide a fleet of 24 more vessels during World War II, interest in the concept was renewed. The warships were constructed in Tampa, Florida, where McCloskey and Company started building after receiving a contract in July of 1943. Steel was in great demand during the conflict, but concrete was cheap and readily available. The ships were built using ferrocement. Not only did this prevent the hull from splitting, but it also made it possible for McCloskey and Company to finish their quota in a short amount of time, 1 ship each month. Only 2 of the 24 concrete ships were used in Europe. As part of the D-Day fleet, the SS David O. Sailor and Vitruvius were sunk 1,000 yards off Normandy shore to serve as an artificial breakwater. As a result, local waterways were calmer, enabling smaller landing boats to transport extra soldiers. The SS Arthur Newell Talbot, Edwin Thatcher, William A. Pollard, William Foster Cowham, Robert Whitman Leslie, John Grant, Willis A. Slater, Leonard Chase Wason, and Richard Kidder Meade were among the 9 concrete ships sent to Kiptopeke Beach in 1948 to act as a barrier for the Little Creek Cape Charles Ferry Terminal. In order to shield the region from bad weather, the ships were destroyed and partially buried in the Chesapeake Bay. The Bay Bridge Tunnel became operational in 1964, a little less than 20 years after the original bridge's opening, giving locals a convenient way to cross the water's mouth. It was decided to keep the ships in place, and the ferry port was closed not long after. The scuttled concrete ships in the Chesapeake Bay are still partially submerged, despite the ferry terminal getting closed down. They not only continue to protect the coastline, but have also turned into a haven for countless bird and marine species. The concrete vessels are not without risks, though. Despite being home to many animal species, officials from the park have put up posters warning people to keep at least 50 feet away from the ships because of exposed rebar that has made the area dangerous. Number 3. Douglas C-117. Solamander Beach, a black sand coast in Iceland, contains a strange plane crash that has gained notoriety. The popularity grew partly as a result of multiple pictures circulating online. Every year, this beach is visited by thousands of tourists. The location has served as the backdrop for a movie, television ads, and even music videos. The light plane stands in sharp contrast to both the dark sand and the amazing northern lights that frequently waltz across the distant sky. From Hofen in Iceland, the Douglas C-117 was flying back to Keflavik. An American radar station in Stocknesses had just gotten equipment from it. The facts surrounding what happened during the flight aren't fully known, and every source seems to present a different version of events. Some claim that the weather played a major role, while others think that ice developing on the wings was the cause of the crash. But it seems like a reasonable assumption that the incident was at least partially as a result of the area's bad weather. The climate in Iceland is erratic. The most accepted explanation says that the pilot switched to the incorrect fuel tank while busy with technical and meteorological issues, causing the aircraft to quickly run out of fuel. On November 21, 1973, the captain James Wick and co-pilot Gregory Fletcher were trapped in a storm and had to deal with thick fog and snow. The aircraft's engine soon stopped running, and they started to lose elevation. The pilots chose to make an emergency landing at sea. But after they were able to get above the thick fog, they realized they were flying over a region that resembled the moon. They were gazing at Solamander Beach. The pilots were compelled to make an emergency landing on the southern coast, utilizing the beach as a runway instead of making the intended sea landing. 18 feet from the ocean, the aircraft came to a stop. On board were 5 crew members. Luckily, everyone made it through alive. They left with urgency since they were genuinely concerned the plane would catch on fire due to the fuel tanks being damaged in the crash. They were able to escape with a few items, including a first aid bag and an old radio. The downed plane was not recovered by the U.S. Navy. Instead, they just took everything expensive or helpful away from the accident scene, leaving only the empty aircraft, which eventually rusted away on the Icelandic shore. The plane was used in a variety of ways by locals after it was abandoned. There are rumors that one farmer dismantled the entire tail portion and sold it, while another might have used it for storage. It also served as target practice, as demonstrated by the abundance of bullet holes in the metal. All that's left of the Douglas C-117 today are the nose, a portion of the fuselage, and half of each of the 2 wings thanks to deterioration over time and illegal usage. A length of soft sand provides access to the site. Initially, because the place was so isolated, many tourist vehicles became trapped here and had to wait hours for help. Impolite motorists frequently caused harm to the nearby plants as they visited the location. As a result, it was decided to restrict cars from traveling along that section of land, and a parking lot was built 2.5 miles away from the crash. Now, the only way to get to Solamander Beach is on foot. The 2-hour hike is worth it to some. Number 2. AlAwliya Scrapyard. Despite being only 12 miles away from Doha, the scrapyard in AlAwliya could not be more diverse. As you turn southwest after leaving the brilliant city, you can find a desert that is nothing like its picturesque dunes. It simply has its own special kind of charm. The enormous scrapyard holds up to 20,000 vehicles at once, including jeeps, trucks, buses, excavators, loaders, bulldozers, cranes, and more. In addition, almost any type of vehicle you could imagine is available, including motorbikes, boats, water scooters, and sand buggies. These cars could be modern, vintage, classic, or antiques. They could be in perfect condition or have minor dents, abandoned, totally or partially destroyed, or even severely burned. Going through the rows of cars coated in dust is reminiscent of a post-apocalyptic scenario. The notion that each car was once prized and possibly even beloved, but is now gathering dust while waiting to be resurrected, is something certainly that has its allure. You can't help but pause and appreciate. Attempts are made to get in touch with the vehicle's owner during a typical 4-month stay. If no one comes forward with a claim, the cars are often destroyed and compacted to be recycled and reused, typically for building purposes. The yard has a separate area for vintage cars, which don't often go through this process. Instead, they're auctioned off to the highest bidders once every year. Number 1. Abandoned Muscle Car Collection. A passionate car collector hit the jackpot in the early 1980s. He filled a barn with multiple Ford Mustangs, Chevy Camaros, Mercury Cougars, and other vintage American vehicles. Unfortunately, things didn't turn out that great, and the lottery winner wasn't able to continue enjoying his collection of vehicles. Despite his large winnings from the lottery, he had reportedly filed for bankruptcy, and the cars had just been sitting, abandoned in a barn, gathering dust for nearly 40 years. The collection would have been worth millions if the vintage American vehicles, including a number of Mustangs, had stayed in somewhat decent shape. But everything is now run down and deteriorating, and in certain cases, they've been vandalized. For example, several of the cars have had their windows smashed, been covered with graffiti, or just punched in with dents. It's possible to save a few vehicles, but they're still only worth a fraction of what they would have been in excellent condition. A Mercury Cougar that could possibly be from the 1987 to 88 period is one of the vehicles found in the lottery winner's barn. Also present is a 1980 Camaro, which had its original owner's manual tucked away inside the glove compartment. Far back in the corner is a first-generation Ford Falcon from the 1960s. Since the car has unbroken glass and shows no indications of corrosion anywhere, it has a good chance of being saved and sold. But in a nearby room, a tragic scene awaits passionate Mustang lovers. A highly desired Fox body Mustang, which seems older than the 87 model, has seen better days. Simply put, it's in awful condition. Two 1960s Mustangs sit among the collection, with the majority of their components missing entirely. In the center of the room, an early Chevrolet Caprice wagon from the 1980s stands in misery, and a Cadillac Seville from the early 1980s, sitting against a wall, looks as if it needs to be shipped to the graveyard. Another Fox body vehicle, a 1960 Mercury Capri, a second Mustang, and a Ford Galaxy convertible from the 1960s, all in quite bad shape, were also seen. This barn has a truly astounding number of Mustangs. Regrettably, none of them received the amount of travel time they should have. Fans and connoisseurs should have been able to see and adore these cars during peak condition. In the front of the room, next to the Cougar and in front of the Camaro, is the worst of the bunch, a 1960s Ford Mustang convertible. The car was extremely harsh both inside and out because it had no roof over the cabin. Ironically, it has a sticker on its bumper that reads, "Let the good times roll." That hasn't happened in quite a while though, and it doesn't seem like it will anytime soon, based on how the lotto winner abandoned the cars.
9. Sukhoi Su-17. Designed during the 1960s, the Sukhoi Su-17 fighter bomber was one of the first Soviet aircrafts to enter into service with a variable sweep design. This meant that its wings could be swept back during flight and returned to their original position before making a landing. It gave the aircraft an aerodynamic advantage, and the Soviet Union continuously worked hard to advance the Su-17 throughout its decades-long career. While some Su-17s remain in limited service today, the vast majority of the nearly 2,900 units that were produced between 1969 and 1990 are now retired. A few have made their way to museums, but others are rotting away in storage or in vehicle graveyards somewhere. One example can be found outside Kaliningrad, Russia, at an abandoned airfield the Nazis built during World War II. Known back then as Airfield Neukölln, the base was first established in 1940 when the area was under German control. It's unclear whether the Soviets used the property after the Germans left. Today, the town it's in is called Pionersky. The site still contains the original hangar and some other historic buildings, as well as the paved platform, which is cracked and overgrown with weeds. What's left of the Su-17 parked at the site is in sorry condition, with its nose missing and holes throughout its fuselage. How it got there and why are a mystery, but it's probably safe to assume that the disused facility once functioned as a convenient storage spot. 8. Secret Storage Bunker. In 2012, photos surfaced online of a seemingly untouched bunker deep in a French forest. Carved out of solid rock during the World War I era, it may have once been part of the Maginot Line that used to dot France's border with Italy and Germany. The secret space is full of military equipment and vehicles dating back from the early 20th century to the Cold War. Included among this collection are a truck from World War II and a Panhard ERC-90 reconnaissance vehicle, which was developed in the mid-70s. They're both in shockingly good condition considering their current location, with their tires still inflated, their paint jobs intact, and little to no rust. Because they're in such pristine shape, some experts have speculated that they belong to an enthusiastic collector who's using the bunker as storage space. But some explorers believe the site was abandoned during the late 80s or early 90s, around the time the Iron Curtain fell. For now, the story behind these vehicles remains a mystery. Regardless of their origins, they're extremely rare thanks to their condition, and it's a shame that they're not on public display somewhere for the public to enjoy. 7. Papa Airbase Graveyard. As one of Hungary's 3 operational military airports, the Papa Airbase is located near the small town of Nagymimor in the country's northwest region. At the edge of the property, there's an abandoned runway with a large aircraft graveyard next to it, filled with over 30 historic planes and vehicles. Built originally during the 1930s, the section of the airbase the plane cemetery sits on remained operational until 1997, when all of its aircraft were retired from service. Many of the vehicles were sold off to museums and collectors, while others were left to rot next to the disused runway. Their tanks were filled with cement to prevent anyone from trying to operate them. For much of the site's history, it was controlled mainly by the Soviet military. The collection includes 5 Sukhoi Su-22 fighter jets and 29 Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-21s. The Su-22 is an export variant of the original Soviet-built Su-17 fighter bomber. It first entered service in 1970 and enjoyed a long career. In most cases, the aircraft also experienced a rather uneventful career. It never really saw much combat in most places it was sent, including Hungary. The MiG-21 is a second-generation supersonic jet fighter developed during the 1950s. It's one of the most produced supersonic jets in aviation history, with nearly 11,500 units rolling off the production line between 1959 and 1985. Sadly, the vintage planes at Papa Airbase are now sinking into the mud from the weight of the concrete inside, and they've fallen victim to many looters over the years, who've started slowly dismantling the aircrafts piece by piece for scrap metal. 6. The tanks of Shikotan Island. Shikotan Island is the largest landmass out of the Lesser Kuril Islands. Its ownership is disputed between Russia, which considers the island part of the Sakhalin region, and Japan, who claim it as part of the Nemuro province. Shikotan's complicated history dates as far back as the 19th century. Russia occupied the island until 1855, when it turned it over to Japan under the Shimoda Treaty. It was retaken by Russia after Japan's defeat in World War II. Since then, there have been periodic negotiations to return the island back to Japan, with Russia agreeing once the two countries signed a peace treaty. But no treaty was ever agreed on, and its current ownership is a confusing matter to say the least. Shikotan is home to a handful of abandoned Soviet tanks, including a few World War II-era IS-2 and IS-3 heavy tanks. The IS-2 entered service back in 1944 during the war's later stages. Its successor, the IS-3, came the following year, but it was too late to see combat. The island also contains a handful of vehicles from the T-54, T-55 series. Like the IS-3, they entered service once World War II ended, with estimated production numbers ranging from somewhere between 96,000 and 100,000. The T-54 544 series is the most produced tank in modern history. And while the T-54 T-55 tanks on Chikitan are rusting and beyond hope of restoration, the series is still in use by many militaries. 5. World War II Army Train. When a photo of a World War II-era US military train surrounded by wilderness popped up on Reddit in 2021, commenters wanted to know its location. Other than clarifying that the vehicle was located somewhere in England, the person who posted the image remained quiet, presumably to protect the aging relic from more damage. An explorer named Imber set out to find the train personally, and after searching for hours, got what he was looking for. Like the Redditor who posted the photo of the machine a few days earlier, he chose not to reveal its whereabouts. After entering World War II after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the US embarked on a major military buildup of American troops across seas in the UK in anticipation of the Allied invasion of Normandy. Known as Operation Bolero, the preparations involved building supply depots around the country, with most being near a main rail line for convenient delivery. The US Army train found in the British forest was most likely used for supplying these depots, most of which disappeared right after D-Day. It's in remarkable condition for its age, with much of its green paint still intact. The surprising war relic has a crane bearing the name of a company called Crafton Cranes Ltd, with its manufactured location identified as Bedford, England. Little else is known about the train, which sits on a lonely, overgrown stretch of railroad track surrounded by lush trees and vegetation. If you found the train, would you have told people where it was? Let us know in the comments and remember to subscribe. 4. Cabell Machine Graveyard. In late 1979, the Soviet Union sent thousands of troops into Afghanistan, sparking an almost decade-long war that claimed nearly 1 million civilian lives and tens of thousands of soldiers. The Soviets took complete military and political control of Cabell and other major cities as they tried to subdue the internal civil warfare. From the beginning, the US and several other countries tried to pressure the USSR into withdrawing from the region, but its forces held out until 1989. In Cabell, they left behind a large collection of tanks and equipment, which continue to litter the landscape even today. Over the years, the Afghan military stripped the more rusted-out vehicles of their parts for use on newer tanks. Most of the remaining machinery has been reduced to little more than corroding heaps of gutted-out metal, trucks, buses, and construction equipment. While some machines were put back in use years ago, this is no longer a realistic option. The vehicles are simply too old, damaged, and picked over for them to have any realistic, practical value. 3. T-55 tanks in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Between 1992 and 1995, Bosnia and Herzegovina were entangled in a brutal civil war between Croatian-backed and Serbian-backed ethnic groups. It was one of many political upheavals and conflicts that broke out after the breakup of Yugoslavia. An estimated 100,000 lives were lost thanks to combat violence and ethnic cleansing, before a UN intervention led to a forced peace negotiations, resulting in a ceasefire and a state that still remains internally divided. The landscape is littered with vehicles left from World War II and the country's own civil war, serving as ever-present reminders of conflict. Outside an abandoned historical museum in Sarajevo, there's a Soviet-built Mil Mi-8 helicopter which served under the Bosnia-Herzegovina Air Force. With several of its windows missing, the graffiti and rust-covered vehicle has had better days. Near the city of Livno, a heavily rusted T-55 tank sits in an empty field with graffiti scrawled in every available space. Several battles were fought in the region during World War II, but the T-55's production came far too late for it to participate, suggesting that the abandoned tank was, perhaps, used during the country's recent civil war. Bosnia and Herzegovina's second-largest city, Banja Luka, contains several World War II-era tanks and tracked vehicles rusting away outside a military barracks, including a Soviet-made T-34-76 and even a German SD-KFZ-251. There's also a Soviet-built Su-76 self-propelled gun, which sits on a discarded tank chassis. Details about the site are scarce, but one Redditor commented that the location is filled with cool vehicles rotting away out in the open. 2. Rare Canadian Ram 2. During the first parts of World War II, before the US was fully involved, Canada had no tanks of its own, and the British had a desperate shortage of vehicles. In 1941, the Canadian military developed the Ram tank based on the Americans' M3 design. By the time production started, the US had entered the war and was producing Sherman Tanks, which the Allies chose as their main cruiser for liberating France and for other crucial missions. Out of the 1,900 Rams built, around 1,500 were sent to England for training and target practice. Less than 30 survive to this day, with the best-known examples being found in Canada, the UK, the Netherlands, and even Australia. In 2020, a group of British hikers from Destination Discovery encountered a bullet-riddled Ram tank in a northern England field. They weren't immediately able to identify the vehicle's exact model, and it wasn't until after they captured and shared footage of it that they realized it was an extremely rare war machine. British historian Mark Felton posted a response to the video, positively identifying the tank as a mid-production model Ram 2. Only 100 of that specific variant were ever built. It's likely that it was left at its current resting place after being used in basic training exercises. 1. Sherman Tanks in India. In late 1961, warfare broke out between India's armed forces and Portuguese-controlled territories, including Goa, Daman and Diu, along the Indian subcontinent's western coast. After failing to peacefully secure the region's independence, Indian troops embarked on a 36-hour barrage of air, sea and land combat strikes. Codenamed Operation Vijay, the battle ended in a major victory for India, ending over 450 years of Portuguese rule over the area. While visiting Karnataka in 2019, a blogger named Nempaguru came across some World War II-era Sherman tanks during a simple walk outside the city of Belgaum. He wrote in a post on teambhp.com that some locals say the Indian military used the vehicles during Operation Vijay. The machines are believed to be an amphibious variant of the M4 Sherman medium tanks called the duplex drive or DD tanks. They're rusty, but they're in decent shape for their age, and are intact enough to offer visitors detailed glimpses at their exterior and a bit of their inner workings. There's no nearby signage explaining their presence, suggesting that they weren't deliberately placed as a monument. They were most likely just abandoned at some point during or after the battle and have remained there since. DD tanks are most famously known for their use during the Allied invasion of Normandy in 1944. They were specifically designed for the operation and saw limited combat after it. By the time Operation Vijay rolled around in 1961, the model was arguably starting to become outdated, which could explain why the last operators were okay leaving them behind. 8. 1964 Jaguar EType. The 1964 Jaguar EType is considered by many to be one of the most beautiful cars ever made. With its curved lines and signature frame, it was capable of reaching speeds of 150 miles per hour. Even rival carmaker Enzo Ferrari believed that the Jaguar was the epitome of elegance. Enzo Ferrari, along with most other classic car enthusiasts, would have been shocked at the state of a 1964 Jaguar E-Type coupe that was discovered abandoned in a barn in 2016. It was no longer the beauty that it once was. But that's what happens when a car sits in a barn for over 40 years. The vehicle's scarlet red paintwork could barely be seen through the thick layer of rust and dirt that accumulated on its exterior. The chrome work, once gleaming, was now dull and caked in grime, and that was just the outside of the car. Who knows what condition it was in under the hood? But who would let such an automotive treasure fester away in a barn? The 1964 E-Type was purchased as a present for the owner's wife in 1970. She drove the sports car for approximately 5 years before it was left in a barn following the birth of their first child. At that point, they felt like a more family-friendly vehicle would be more appropriate for them. Even though it was never driven again, the family couldn't face the thought of parting with it. And so it sat forgotten until the owner died, which was when it was finally rediscovered again. In October 2016, shortly after it was found, the Jaguar was auctioned off by H&H Classics in London. Despite its condition, it sold for an incredible $80,800, equivalent to almost $100,000. The new owner definitely has a big task ahead of them, as the cost of restoration will almost certainly be more than the auction price. 7. The Abandoned Animatronics. In 1989, the Cranium Command exhibit at Epcot was installed in the Wonders of Life Pavilion, offering tourists an educational journey through the human brain. The two characters in Cranium Command were General Knowledge and Buzzy. General Knowledge was a drill sergeant-type figure who would brief visitors on the goal before entering the ride. Buzzy was a tiny soldier, learning how to pilot the body of a 12-year-old kid who would guide them through the attraction while they were enjoying the experience. Cranium Command was always overshadowed by its fellow attraction, Body Wars, which instead of the brain focused on taking guests around the rest of the human body. Over time, Cranium Command moved from being a permanent attraction to a seasonal one in 2003. Then, in 2007, it finally closed for good, leaving the ride and its animatronics abandoned. This was unusual for the resort at the time. Typically, closed-down attractions would be dismantled quickly to avoid people trying to explore them, and props and animatronics would usually be incorporated into other rides to reuse them. But because the ride was left to decay in the park, it became frequented by the occasional urban explorer for over a decade. And in 2018, the resort claimed that Buzzy had disappeared. An ex-employee turned urban explorer was arrested after posting a picture of the animatronic's face on their Twitter account. However, this didn't lead to any prosecutions. To this day, Buzzy hasn't been found, leaving many to speculate on where the animatronic ended up. 6. Collins Barn. Collins Barn was an odd hobbit-like building that was constructed by a farmer in the 1980s to shelter his sheep. It's currently abandoned in the middle of nowhere in Chedlow, England. This isn't just some casual door in a hillside either. The structure is made entirely out of stone and has 2 stories, making it more of a hobbit castle than a hobbit hut. It apparently took 11 years for farmer Colin Stokes to build by hand. The barn is complete with towers, elaborate handmade stained glass windows, sculpted plaster details on the inside, and other features such as birdhouses for flying visitors. But what caused such an amazing construction to be abandoned? Colin Stokes used to own and farm the property, even sleeping on the 2nd floor of it during lambing season to look after his flock. Sadly though, he sold it all when a quarry was built nearby, threatening to disrupt the calm surroundings he loved. Stokes relocated to Scotland in the year 2000 to begin a new millennium with a fresh new start. Over 20 years after Colin Stokes left his creation, it still stands today. It continues to entertain urban explorers that come to see it, and it puts the small Wiltshire community of Chedlow on the map. 5. A Labyrinth of Books. There's a street in Tunis, Tunisia that's famous for its antique bookstores, known as Dabaghine Street. However, the people of Tunis aren't exactly all that big on reading, leading to an amazing abandoned treasure trove that would be any book lover's delight. In one of the many bookshops, the ground floor might look normal, but if you gain access to the upstairs floor, you'll find a labyrinth of old abandoned books. The sheer amount of titles is stacked up on top of each other to create a wall of books that reaches the ceiling. They even creep around the staircase up to the top floor, meaning that you need to watch your step wherever you go. In some places, you'll need to tiptoe around them and squeeze through tiny gaps. Every genre imaginable can be found here, with children's picture books nestled next to literary classics. One thing is for sure though, if they fell on top of you, you'd quite easily be buried under the landslide of paperbacks. We don't know whether there's any plans to get rid of the books, either by throwing them away, donating them, or selling them. So for now, the abandoned library simply continues to grow. If you were offered $10,000, would you spend the night in a haunted abandoned amusement park by yourself? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. 4. The abandoned cars of Dubai. Dubai has a serious car culture, as does the United Arab Emirates in general, with a particular taste for the latest and best in high-end supercars. But what happens when you can't afford to keep your luxury motor going anymore? The answer in Dubai seems to be abandon them. Cars like Ferraris, Mercedes, and other luxury brands are left in airport car parks or on the side of the road, simply gathering dust. Thanks to the desert environment, this dust and sand buildup is pretty impressive, making it easy for passers-by to leave messages and pictures on the vehicles. But what would force so many people to have to abandon such expensive automobiles? Dubai, like the rest of the globe, has fallen on hard times. A few years ago, Dubai was an investor's paradise, filled with opportunity thanks to the booming oil and property markets. Many foreign investors moved to the city in order to take advantage of the huge possibilities for growth. And what better way to showcase their new wealth than by purchasing a supercar or two? But the dream couldn't last for long, and the global economic crisis led to many people losing their fortunes. As a result, they simply couldn't keep their cars. And because lots of people were in similar situations, it meant that there was no market for them to be sold. Many people have been left in desperate financial straits as a result of the economy crashing. With mounting debts that they were unable to repay, thousands of families started to leave Dubai as quickly as they could. Therefore, their cars would be left to decay at airports or on the side of the road. Sometimes the vehicle owners would leave apology notes on the windscreen of the cars that they left behind, and some were in such a hurry that they even left the keys in the ignition. Dubai has since started to seize cars that have been left for months on end, although at times they can barely keep up with the amount of vehicles that have been left abandoned around the city. The cars that are collected are then auctioned off. So if you've ever wanted a supercar for cheap, it's the perfect chance to buy one. 3. The airplane in Antarctica. On October 8, 1970, a Lockheed Constellation Pegasus plane crash landed into the icy tundra of Antarctica after flying through severe weather conditions, leaving it with no other choice. Severe winds managed to rip the right engine mount and even the propeller from the aircraft. Thankfully, no one was hurt during the crash, but the plane was left where it fell, and over the next few decades it sat abandoned. However, the Lockheed Pegasus does have its own legacy. The icy, flat area where the plane crashed is now called the Pegasus White Ice Runway. It even has its own handmade sign. The site is now an Antarctic tourist attraction, with many people venturing out to take a look at the aircraft, some of them even scratching their initials into the fuselage. Thanks to the cold conditions, the Pegasus is still in great condition and hasn't rusted or decayed in the same way other planes around the world would typically deteriorate. And because of its location, it's most likely the most southerly piece of graffiti in the world. 2. The abandoned ammunition plant trucks. In Sydney, Nebraska, a World War II ammunition plant sits abandoned. That was until Rob Van Vliet took over the site and turned it into an automotive treasure trove. The Rob Van Vliet collection, as it's now known, is made up of between 1,500 to 1,800 vehicles. In fact, there's so many that even Rob himself has lost track of how many cars and trucks he has on the lot. All of the vintage vehicles here look abandoned, with many of them in derelict condition. However, there are some true treasures to be found here if you know where to look. If you like the classic Diamond T, there's many of them here in all shapes and sizes, including a semi and a wrecker truck. You can also find International Harvester pickup trucks, a rare vintage discovery. Some of the trucks were sold at auction in 2022, such as a 1937 REO Speedwagon pickup, a 1915 Stewart motor truck, and a 1937 Studebaker K10 Coupe Express pickup. Some of the Diamond T trucks were also sold at the same time, including a one-of-a-kind truck that was custom-built and designed for the Canadian distiller Seagram's. There are also Ford trucks, Chevys, and vintage cars from the 1930s too. But since the owner isn't even sure what's in the lot, who knows what other abandoned vehicles might be lurking in this massive car yard. 1. 42 former presidents. You might expect to see stone figures of former presidents at Mount Rushmore in South Dakota, but you can find an entire field of them abandoned in Virginia. In a field near Williamsburg are the statues of 42 former presidents that have been sitting in the location since 2010, but why would they be left here? The statues were originally part of the President's Park installation in the town. The park was created in 2004 by local landowner Everett Haley Newman and Houston sculptor David Addix, who was deeply influenced to make the massive busts after driving by Mount Rushmore. At a cost of $10 million, the park was an open-air museum of sorts, with visitors invited to freely walk around the grounds and view the carved stone statues of past political leaders. The park would only be open for 6 short years before it was forced to close due to a lack of visitors in 2010. Howard Hankins, who'd helped construct the park when it was first opened, was contacted by Newman again, but this time he wanted to destroy the statues as the land had been foreclosed on. Hankins was reluctant to let all his hard work go to waste. Plus, taking a sledgehammer or bulldozer to a president's face, even a stone one, didn't seem all that appealing. Instead, he suggested that the statues, all 42 of them, be moved to some farmland that he owned, in order to keep them safe until he figured out what to do with them. Newman agreed, and Hankins began the arduous task of transporting all of the heavy, 22,000-pound presidential busts into the field, where they've been ever since. But it wasn't exactly smooth sailing when it came to moving the statues to their new home. A crane had to remove each bust off its foundation, shattering the sculpture's neck, to raise the entire piece off the ground. The presidents were then hoisted into flatbed trucks and carried away to Hankins' farm. As a result, many of the statues bear battle scars from their transition, especially those that were moved first while Hankins and his team were still figuring out how to transport them. Many of them now have broken noses and cracked features, and ironically the statue of Abraham Lincoln is missing the back of his head. It's not just the move that's affected the statues, as the weather's also taken its toll. Ronald Reagan bears a mark from a lightning strike, and many others appear to be crying from the water that's pooled and dried in and around their features over time. The site isn't open to the public, though many have commented on it as they've driven by, and braver explorers have found ways to get onto the property to have a closer look at the statues. For now, these statues remain where they are, although Hankins hopes he can find a new home for them soon. He plans to work with local governments in order to rebuild President's Park into a bigger and better venture. Which one of these abandoned finds did you think was the most surprising? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye!